While scholars and policymakers still think of economic factors as contributing to democratization, the relationship between economic development and democracy has become less clear over time. While there's still a strong correlation between wealth and democracy, recent transitions to democracy have challenged the idea that they are the result of class or cultural change. The type of transition countries experience has also changed. Revolutions and gradual transitions have been replaced by nonviolent protest and negotiated agreements. A recent trend in backsliding to authoritarianism may also challenge the link between development and democratic stability. Hungary is by far the richest country to date to adopt more authoritarian practices. This video will discuss recent trends in democratization, the potential causes of recent transitions, and conclude with speculation on the reasons for this change, including the erosion of distinctions between democracy and dictatorship, learning, and the simple passage of time. The third wave of democratic transitions took place from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. The earliest transitions were likely caused by economic factors. In Southern Europe, Latin America, and East Asia, democratization followed years of economic growth and a rising middle class. These transitions were generally managed through pacts. These are agreements among the existing political elite to liberalize politics. In some cases, notably South Korea and Taiwan, the incumbent party won the first multi-party elections, and it was years, 1997 in South Korea and 2000 in Taiwan, before the opposition party actually took over. In other cases, new parties formed and competed in the first election. The later phase of the third wave was defined by the end of communism. Popular uprisings spread across Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union declined to intervene in protests in Poland in 1988 and 89. These uprisings were generally nonviolent, Romania was the exception, and were cast as movement for the national rights of the citizens in each country. The subsequent dissolution of the Soviet Union launched a wave of multi-party elections around the world, most notably among the former single-party states in Africa, as the model, and sometime patron, of single-party rule disappeared. The primary cause of democratization in these cases, then, was a combination of international and domestic factors. What all of these transitions share, however, is that they were really clear-cut. The transitions were marked either by the first democratic or the first multi-party elections in years. Not all of these transitions resulted in stable democracy. Most former Soviet and African states became electoral authoritarian regimes, but the initial transition was at least clear. Subsequent events have not been so clear. We tend to think about contemporary cases of democratization in terms of how they happened, not why. These processes are not generally new. For example, post-World War II reconstruction contributed to the successful democratization of Germany, Austria, Italy, and Japan, and most transitions have involved protest in some form or another, but their dynamics have changed. As civil war has replaced international conflict as the primary form of conflict in the world, international organizations have increasingly advocated for elections and democratic institutions as ways to manage conflict as part of a peace settlement. This has met with mixed success. Democracy does not always address the underlying causes of conflict, and electoral campaigns can encourage demagoguery and violence. For example, although the Salvadoran Civil War ended in 1994, the FMLN was not able to win an election victory until 2009. Political violence declined at the end of the war, but criminal violence rose, and El Salvador's democracy is still challenged. Similarly, mass protest movements have been part of most transitions to democracy. This isn't something new. The past 20 years have, however, experienced a rise in the importance of mass movements as part of those transitions, and a rise in transnational protests. Here, the reasons for the diffusion of protests from one country to another is not the removal of the influence of an outside power, like the Soviet Union, but rather enhanced communication and demonstration effects. The mass availability of technology has definitely contributed to these movements, but claims that the internet was making protests in Iran in 2009 or the Arab world in 2010 possible were a little overblown, or at least premature. The most transformative technology has been the mobile phone, not social networks. These movements are organized through texting and word of mouth more than Twitter or other platforms. That said, online mobilization has grown in sophistication and reach over the past decade and has been a significant factor in protests in 2020 in countries including Belarus, Hong Kong, and Thailand. What is most unique about contemporary transitions to democracy, however, is the idea of democratization by election. This may once have seemed to be an oxymoron, elections being one of the defining characteristics of democracy. But accidental or permitted victories by opposition parties in authoritarian elections is now the most common means of transition. This can happen in two basic ways. In some cases, including Mexico and Malaysia, an opposition party wins an election after years of competing in multi-party elections under unfair conditions. These cases are usually preceded by decisions by the ruling party to allow slightly freer elections. Opposition parties focus almost entirely on mobilizing citizens to vote, and the ruling party accepts the outcome of the elections. While it's a bit too soon to call Malaysia's transition as successful, these types of transitions by election typically result in improvements in a country's political rights and moves towards further democratization. In most cases, however, transitions happen after dictators do worse than expected at the ballot box and try to cover it up. The Philippines was an early example of this. Ferdinand Marcos held early elections in 1986, and the official election commission declared him the winner. But independent monitors counted a vote tally of almost 70% in favor of his opponent, Corazon Aquino. Mass political protests forced Marcos to flee the country, and the Philippines began a long transition towards democracy. Similarly, in Serbia in 2000, opposition parties were able to use independently produced election polls to demonstrate they were the real winner of the elections. Subsequent demonstrations then forced former President Milosevic from office. This second type of transition has been much less stable than other forms. Even countries that experience an expansion of political freedoms, like the Republic of Georgia, can get caught in cycles of repeated revolutions to change power. After removing Eduard Shevardnadze in the Rose Revolution of 2003, Georgians then also removed his successor, Mikhail Saakashvili, through protests in 2013. Similarly, Kyrgyzstan experienced the Tulip Revolution of 2005 and a second revolution in 2010. And just last week, October 14th, protesters again forced the resignation of the president after questionable elections on October 4th and placed in power an opposition figure who had been imprisoned for kidnapping a rival politician. So what causes transitions to democracy today? The conventional wisdom is institutions. The fact that most dictatorships are holding elections, the core institution of democracy, blurs the line between regime types, but also provides an institutional means for transition to take place. In addition, as Valerie Bunce and Sharon Walchik describe in Defeating Dictators, opposition politicians have been able to develop clever strategies to take advantage of the opportunity elections provide. Institutional arguments may also explain why many of these transitions to democracy fail. Dictators learn new strategies over time, just like opposition leaders, after all. In addition, there is an argument to be made that democratization is more likely to fail when regime transitions happen before state development, that the sequencing of state building and regime change matters. We'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. Economic factors, in particular poor economic performance by incumbents, do still play a role, as do some cultural factors. Here, there isn't a particular type of culture that is conducive to democracy, but instead, culture provides a means to facilitate the diffusion of pro-democracy movements around regions. Communication about protests tends to happen within trusted groups, and transitions in one country can provide the strongest demonstration effect in neighboring countries. It works best when you see people like you facing down similar challenges and succeeding. So this may be one reason why color revolutions were a former Soviet phenomenon, and the Arab Spring stayed in the Middle East. I'd like to end by noting that it may simply be the case that not enough time has passed to really evaluate the democratic transitions of the past 20 years. Structural causes like economic development are long-term causes, not immediate explanations for different events. The relationship between development and democracy may have changed with wider changes in the global economy, but it may also just take time for economic factors to influence political institutions. And as Dahl noted, it's generally remained true that gradual transitions to democracy have resulted in more stable democracies. Time will tell.